Best practices for performance. When we're designing applications, we have to consider the performance of what the user sees, and of course, the performance of the entire environment of the platform. It's useless for the IT teams to make important investments in the infrastructure if the designers who are creating applications aren't taking into account these best practices. So we've already seen lots of best practices during this course, but in this section, we're going to see best practices related to performance. This is going to be an affordable and fast way to solve all kinds of performance issues. The first thing we have to do is think, when should we actually invest in design? It's not always a good idea. So this would be one of the best practices I'd like to share with all of you, because as everything in life, we have to find a balance with what we do. Although apparently a good design has a lot of advantages, there's moments when investing in design could be a bad idea. So here we have a few questions that we should ask ourselves before investing resources on improving the design. For example, is the design going to make the implementation and maintenance more difficult? Well, to be honest, lots of times we could even code or develop our own products and connect them to the platform. And that's okay. That's not a problem. We can create, for example, an interface. We can create a form with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then connect it to the platform. Is this a good idea? Maybe. Is it more difficult to develop and to maintain? Yes, it is. So we have to find a balance. When are we going to use these features? Well, maybe if we have a customer that's working with us and needs a very specific feature with a very specific effect or something like that, well, then maybe we might go for this specific design created with code. But in most cases, we're going to want to create quick, fast implementations, and we're going to want to use the default no-code features that the platform has to give us. What happens when the design affects the performance? Maybe I want to add a beautiful image. It's a huge image, a very high resolution 4K, 8K image, and I know my design is going to look awesome with it. But maybe not everyone who's accessing the interface has a good connection to internet. Maybe they don't even have a good device. So maybe if I'm testing out my applications with my top-notch mobile phone, it might work perfectly, but we have to take into account that not everyone is going to have that same phone or is going to have that same internet or Wi-Fi connection. So we have to be careful. If we're affecting design, if we're affecting performance, maybe we're going to have to compromise in design. The resources that are destined for design implementation, if they detract the functionality in the implementation, would this really be desirable? So we're going to have to decide whether we want to add more resources to these designs if they're going to be detracting functionality. Whether functionality or design, is this really what the user needs? So we really have to focus on the user's needs, not on what we want to build for them, but what they're expecting and what they need the system to do for them. Basically, with this, I want to say that design and functionality should always complement each other to offer usable interfaces. Now, we're going to see several best practices. They're supposed to be followed by people who already understand the application, who already know how to use it, because we're not going to enter into detail in the configuration options. These are things that we've already learned throughout the different courses. And this is more for people who've already been using the application, who already have experience building different solutions. So we're going to go to this next best practice. It's called provide informative feedback. So we have to be acknowledging. Occasionally we can't improve the performance, but we can offer feedback to the user so they understand why they're waiting for several seconds. When we have to wait for something to happen, that's not a problem, as long as we know why we're waiting. For example, last night before I went to bed, my phone told me, we're going to be working on some updates. It's going to take some minutes. Do you want to start? Okay, I hit the button yes, and my phone started to update. Obviously, this took, I think, about 20 minutes. After the updates were installed, I was able to continue using my phone. For me, it wasn't really important that I had to wait these 20 minutes because I knew what was happening and I was deciding that I wanted that to happen. But if I have to wait with the uncertainty of what's happening, that's really frustrating for the user. So we should always give information. When a user has to wait, it doesn't matter if it's a short time or a long time. We should give him information. We should give him feedback. So feedback is typically associated with points of action. Every time a user interacts with the system, he wants to know what's happening. So if they find a clear reaction to what they've done, they're not going to be worried about it. So a system with feedback for every action is going to help them achieve their goals without frustration. For some of these actions that they perform, well, we can provide maybe an indication, some text that their action has been acknowledged. For example, if I finish a form, it's really nice when I see a confirmation division telling me your request was submitted successfully or something like that. Or maybe changing the label of the button. When I click on it, I want it to change. So maybe it says submit request, and once I click on it, it says submitted. Okay, these are all features that we have in the platform, and you guys should already know how to use them. And this is going to provide feedback to the users. So if we don't do this, users are going to have to double check, or maybe they click on the button and suddenly the window disappears and they're frustrated. They think, what's happened? Or maybe they click on a button and it's loading for 20 seconds. They have no idea why that's happening. Maybe their computer crashed. So that's going to cause a lot of frustration. Here in this example, we're saying, would you like to synchronize your contacts? Yes or no? How many would you like to synchronize? And then here we're giving them valuable information. We're saying, when you click on the button, we're going to synchronize all your contacts, and the duplicated ones are going to be listed, and this is going to take a few minutes. Perfect. If I read this and I decide to click on the button, it doesn't matter if I have to wait a few minutes. The problem is when I don't know what's happening with my form. So this is very important. Let's go on to the next one. There's a lot of best practices out there for the use of images. Here I'm not going to stop too much to talk about the different techniques, but obviously we should at least do a quick research on the internet and try to learn where are the most important techniques. Here we have an example of a form, and as the background of a form, I decided to add an image. I could do different things. For example, I could add this image that has 1 pixel of width and 1000 pixels of height. And here I have another image. It's 1000 pixels times 1000 pixels. So what's going to happen when the form has to load this image? It's going to take very little time. Here is going to take half a second. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use this image here, and I'm going to say I want this image to be repeated horizontally. So for the system, this is really fast. It has to load a very small image, and once it's loaded it, all it has to do is repeat it horizontally. This is way much faster than using this other image. Another good practice I could mention is, for example, I've seen people get a huge 8K resolution image and downsize it to a much smaller size and add it as the background of a form, for example, or of a division. This isn't very convenient because you're trying to load a huge image, and at the end of the day, you're just using it for a very small space. So you're not supposed to do this either. Or, I don't know, or using different formats. For example, there's certain formats like PNG that are quite good. They're faster to load. And there's other formats like JPEG, or I don't know, there's all kinds of other formats. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but there's formats that it takes browsers a longer time to be able to display them on a screen. So it would be interesting to go to the internet, make a quick search, and learn at least the most important techniques when using images. This is going to help us improve the performance in our forms and in our pages, our portals, etc. This best practice is called optimistic user interface, and I'm going to give you guys an example. In lots of cases, or in some scenarios, when we need to perform several actions, sometimes we don't really need to let the user know. And besides, we could be optimistic. We could just immediately tell him, look, whatever you're trying to do has been performed correctly. Okay? So in this example, let's say we go to a secondhand website. This could be, I don't know, eBay or secondhand.com or whatever website we use to publish our products, our secondhand products. And lots of times what we do is we publish, we add our images, we add our description to the product, the name, and so on. And as soon as we click on the button to publish it, it tells us, voila, your product has been published. Here's a link. You can copy the link and you can see the product that has been published. So internally, these sites, they're actually not finished. They still have a lot of things to do. Sometimes they even have to perform actions that require human intervention. For example, maybe they have to review the announcement. They have to make sure I'm not selling anything illegal. But they're not going to bother telling me, well, we still have to do this and this and that. No, they're just going to tell, look, this has been published. And basically what they do, they give me a link. I can see the publication, although other people can't really see it. I can see it because I'm the creator. And I know sometimes they use other algorithms, like maybe because you're accessing from the same IP that created the announcement and things like that. But anyways, they give me a link immediately. I can copy that link and I can see my announcement. So the visual response is actually appearing much before those actions have been triggered. This is known as optimistic user interface. So let's say, for example, I want to publish a product, and as soon as I click on the button, this button has to deviate to a publishing process. And after that, it terminates a task and it changes the button name to published. So it does this immediately. It doesn't really matter if that process that I deviated to has been completed successfully. Because, to be honest, let's be optimistic. What's going to go wrong? All we have to do is review the announcement and do some other, automatic updates and so on. But in the worst case scenario, all we're going to do is tell the person who created this announcement, we're going to send them a message telling them we have to take out your announcement because it doesn't meet the legal requirements or whatever. Okay, so this is another best practice when we're designing things for users. Another interesting thing, we can see this message down here, is when we're making changes in the forms, the system is going to perform certain things internally. For example, it's going to empty the cache. This is going to cause a warning message to appear in the forms that we've opened after making these changes. This warning is, let's say it's for administrators, for designers, because it's not very common to see these messages in products that have already been tested and published and end users are interacting with them. Because those type of applications that we build, they're not going to be modified on a daily basis. But when we're testing, when we're running tests, or when we're building something from scratch, it is very common to test and modify. So each time we modify, this little pop-up message is going to warn us, telling us, hey, look, this took some time to load because you're making modifications. Once you stop making these modifications, the form is going to be able to perform much faster. Okay, so we can't base, this isn't reliable information. If the form took 5 seconds to open, this isn't reliable information. Once we stopped making changes and we've started to use the form several times, we're going to see how it loads much faster. So once we have reliable data, we're going to be able to analyze this data and know if it's actually performing correctly or if it's taking too much time. Later on, I'm going to show you guys a report that we've already talked about previously in this course, but we're going to see it again because it's related to this feature here. When we want to see the performance of our forms, we're going to see that occasionally in certain scenarios, our forms are taking longer to load. And this is due, well, maybe to changes that we've done in the form, or maybe we're updating the server or things like that. But anyway, we'll get to that later. The next best practice that I want to show you guys is the difference between triggers and conditions. Whenever we can, we're going to trigger things. Why? Because they're much faster than conditions. If I have to evaluate conditions all the time, the performance in my form is going to be much worse. If I have to evaluate triggers, that's going to be much quicker. So when I'm designing things, let's imagine this scenario where I have 3 divisions, and here it says, well, did you like the food? No is going to trigger the division B, and yes is going to trigger the division C. I could achieve the same result with conditions because I could condition division B and I could also condition the division C, and it would act exactly the same. So there's actually different ways of configuring things sometimes, but we always have to choose whatever's best for performance. So in this scenario, obviously, if I configured the triggers of the yes/no field, it's going to be way much better than conditioning these divisions. This next practice is quite important in scenarios where we're working with large forms with a lot of fields. We're going to want to distribute the loading times. So let's say I'm building a very large form and it has different steps or it has different divisions. There's several options. I could actually say I want to load absolutely everything from the beginning, or I want to load little by little. So first I'll load one of the divisions, afterwards I'll load the next one, and so on. So as it says here, there's two ways of distributing the load times and optimizing them by using this feature. So you can use several divisions and load them according to the needs of the user, or you could actually load everything at once. Besides, we can also use several forms in one unique object. So we're going to see the difference between loading everything at once, loading divisions, or even creating different forms for one object. So here we can see an example on what to choose in each different scenario. As we're saying here, these are best practices. I can't tell you this is the perfect way to go in every single scenario, but I'm going to give you some tips so you guys can know what to choose in each scenario. So there's an option in the application. It says improve performance when loading the forms. This option is going to do, it's going to open the form, and it's not going to take so much time because it's only going to load what it really needs to load. For example, if I need to display division 1, it's going to take maybe, I don't know, half a second to load. Okay. Now, once it's loaded division 1, it's not going to bother loading division 2 until the user actually interacts with the platform and says it needs to visualize division 2. And the same thing happens with division 3 until you finish the form. Okay, so basically you're loading the different divisions on demand, on the user's demand. You're not loading them all at the beginning. So this is the most convenient form when we have a lot of elements, when we have conditional logic, when we have divisions that may not be required. This would be the example that I showed in the previous slide where we had 4 divisions and maybe not all of them are required. So why would we want to load everything at once? Let's say it takes 1 second per division. Why would I ever want to load 4 divisions if maybe according to the conditional logic, I'm only going to have to see 1? So why would I make the user wait 4 seconds if I could display the information in 1? So in these scenarios, we're going to use this option here. But there's other scenarios where we might want to use this option down here. So we want to improve the performance when loading the divisions. That means that I load absolutely everything at the beginning. And once everything is loaded, then I can hide or trigger or show the different divisions or different elements that I have in the form. This option is quite convenient when we're using very simple forms with a little amount of elements. And then we have this last option. This would be a combination of both of the previous ones because basically what we're going to do, we're going to create a form with several different steps. And once we've created our form, we're going to add divisions in each step, and we're going to distribute the loading times not only between the different divisions, but also between the different steps. In order to do this, we have to go to the object to configure it, and we have to create more than one step. I'm going to enter the application and I'm going to show you this feature. Here we can see a process I have created just for this demonstration. And when I click here on form, we're going to see that I've created several forms, several steps. So all I have to do is click on the button create, as if I'm going to create any old form, and I'll add it here to this list, and I'll design each one with whatever look and feel I want. Now, in each one of these, I could click on settings, I could add a name for the tab, and I could indicate what's going to happen when people click on these tabs. For example, do I want to show the form according to its design? Or maybe I want to show it only in read mode. This would make it load much faster. Or maybe I want to allow this tab to be available but only visible. I don't want it to be clickable. We might want to use this option when we don't want someone to navigate through the different tabs. We want them to use buttons in order to go to the next step or to the previous step. That's because we might want to add additional configurations or uploads or settings in those buttons. So we want to better control. In this case, we select this option here. We could also indicate if we want to remember this tab if I close the form and the user goes back in. And I could also indicate if I want to check mandatory fields when I want to move from one tab to the other one. So here we have an example of what it would look like. So we have 3 tabs up here. I have step 1, step 2, step 3. And besides, since I marked the option where I have to fill in all the mandatory fields before going to step 2, when I click on it, well, I'll get a message telling me you have to fill in this mandatory field. Okay, so this is really easy to create. All we have to do is open the form. Once we open the form, we have to create the steps. We can indicate the order if we want these tabs to be visible or not. Here we have a few design options. For example, if the corporate look and feel of our company is red, we can say we want a red color. We can change the background color. And then here in the settings is where we mark these options that I just mentioned. Now let's say I enter this step here. Within each one of these steps, I could have lots of divisions too. So, well, in this case, I only have one, but let's say I have lots of divisions, conditional logic, and so on. So this option that I just showed you guys, it's very convenient for very large complex forms with lots of steps and fields. Besides, it's not only convenient for the end user because we can distribute the loading times between all these different steps, but it's also very convenient for the designer because we can divide our form in all these different steps. And that means that different designers could be developing these steps at the same time. Maybe I could have one of the designers, one of the consultants that's working on this step here. Maybe they have to, I don't know, add all the request details, maybe for it's a loan request. And then here, maybe we have certain documentation that has to be uploaded. So here someone's preparing the step where lots of documents have to be attached and so on. And maybe there's another designer who's designing this last step where maybe we have to enter the bank details. So maybe we have to put our credit card or I don't know, whatever. So not only can I divide the workload of this activity, of the configuration of this activity, but later on, it's going to be much faster when I have to maintain it. Let's say I have a very, very large form. Maybe it's not only 3 steps or 4 steps, maybe it's even 10 steps. Every single step has about 20 to 30 divisions, and each one of these divisions has maybe dozens or hundreds of fields. Later, when I want to maintain it, it's going to be much faster if I need to enter step 2 than if I'd have to enter one unique form with all of those divisions, with all of those conditions, with all of those fields. So in those complex scenarios, I'd go for this configuration down here. There's another feature, it's called generic forms. This feature is very interesting when we need to share information across platforms. So let's say I have a process. Obviously, this is quite simple. It's just a straightforward process for an example where I have up to 10 different tasks. Now, the star message event has a request form with about 30, well, it says 50 fields. So I have about 50 fields here. And the next object is an approval task. Here we have 5 fields. But besides having these 5 fields, I still need to access these 50 fields. Now, here we have a way of reusing this form here. We could actually copy the form and have it copied into this one here. Or I could access this form from this object here. All I have to do is I have to create a generic form. Maybe I can call it request. And then each time I'm configuring a new form, for example, the legal task, the approval task, a review task, or whatever other tasks I have, all I have to do is add a button. And in this button, I could call this generic form. And this generic form is going to show me the fields that I have in the panel of this process. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm creating a view of certain fields that I have in this process. And I can display this view with any button that I have in a form or by using an external form. Okay? So the only steps that we have to do in order to configure this is, first of all, we have to create a generic form. We can go here and create it. And after we've created it, we can add the generic form to any other form. We can do this by using a button or by using an external form and embedding the form within any other form. So here it's actually being triggered with a button, but I could also have it embedded. So for the user, it would look like part of his form. Now, what's the advantage of doing this? Here we have 2 scenarios, so we can see the advantage. I have scenario A, where I'm not using generic forms. So what I did is, first the client asks for some changes in the request form. So first I had 50 fields, and now suddenly the customer is telling me, hey, you know what? I needed to add a few more fields here. Or I needed to add some information or some text, whatever. Now, the change is going to take me about 10 minutes to make this new implementation in the generic form. Or in this case, in this first scenario, in the star message event. So I'll have this change done within 10 minutes. But now these changes have to be carried out in all these different tasks. This means that all the changes are going to take about 110 minutes. Because basically whatever I modified here, now I have to enter this next task and I have to make the modifications here, because here I actually copied the previous form. So once I've copied the forms, I'm duplicating those forms. They're not connected to each other. So when I have to make a change in this one here, it doesn't affect this object here. But let's say I'm using generic forms. So I'm in scenario B, where what I'm actually doing is in each one of these objects, I'm just embedding or I'm using the generic form. Okay, so I created this generic form with these 50 fields, and now the customer comes along and tells me, you know what, now I need you to add these new features, these new fields, or a new button or whatever. Okay, it's going to take me 10 minutes. That's all it's going to take me. I don't have to invest any more time. Why? Because once I did the modification here in the generic form, since all these different tasks of my process are actually viewing the information of this generic form, once I make the modification in this unique place, it rolls out immediately through the entire process. So we also have to take this into account when we're building applications, when we're building processes, and we might want to use generic forms to earn some time. These generic forms are also quite useful when we're using maybe a report, a deep BI report. This is something we've seen previously in the course. So we want the deep BI report to display a generic form where I want to allow maybe certain administrators, certain users to directly input or update data inside of the panel of this process. So this is going to allow us to have more flexibility, to be able to visualize the information on my process. So basically what I'm creating is a view. With this option here, I'm creating a view of whatever's happening within the process. Another thing we can do when we're trying to improve the performance is not to display all the data that we have in the grid at once. So sometimes when we access a family or we access a group of fields in the form, so there's different grids that we don't really need to display all the information. Maybe there's hundreds or thousands of rows inside of that group of fields, and we don't need to display everything when the form is open or when we access a family with data. So we can configure it so it only displays the data once we've actually added the filters. So maybe we can add filters to the group of fields, and once the user inputs some information in the filters and hits the button proceed, then we're going to display the information. This is more or less how Google works. When we're doing a Google search, it doesn't show us the result of the search. As soon as we enter the page, it waits for us to filter the information. So first it asks us for some feedback. Once we input some data, then we click on a button and it shows us all the results. Well, this would be the same. Instead of opening a form and directly displaying all the data that we have in the system, what we want to do sometimes is open the form. It's not displaying absolutely anything. And when the user enters a value in the filters and clicks on the proceed button, then we're going to show them the information. We also have to take into account that there's a lot of different places in the application where we can update the information. We have to be very careful with these options because these are going to require quite a few resources when we're accessing an interface. So let's say every time we open a form, we're updating the suffixes or we're updating the calculations or the business rules and so on. And we don't need it. It's very important to be careful not to enable all these updates if we don't really need them. So this is something I've seen quite often. Someone designs a form, they just enable all the different updates. So there's all kinds of updates enabled in the form, and then they're having performance issues. That's because they weren't careful, they didn't make sure to check only those options that they really needed. So in order to do things correctly when we're using these actions, we only need two things. First of all, we need to know these options. We need to know how they work. We need to know how to update fields, how to update suffixes, how to update the values of a group of fields, how to update rules that are being used in an interface. Okay, once we know all these features, the next thing we need to know how to do, or the next thing we want to do, is to do things right. So as long as we're thorough and we go and we build our interface, taking all of these features into account and selecting only the ones that we really need, then obviously the performance in these interfaces is going to be much better. Another tip I want to give you is if you have buttons with all kinds of different actions that don't need to be triggered in a button, just leave them in the diagram, in a system task in the diagram. For example, here we have a scenario where when the user clicks on a button, suddenly it starts to trigger all these updates. It creates a security copy, it creates a document and so on. And then the last action it has here is it finishes. So for the end user, what's going to happen is it's going to take a few seconds maybe to finish. And we're not interested in having this unless it's really necessary. So if it's not necessary, we can just grab all these actions, put them in a system task after the human intervention. And that way, no user is going to notice that the system is taking maybe 2 or 3 seconds to load while it's doing all of these things. The system is going to do it anyways internally, but the user doesn't have to know. So we have to make sure to configure these type of actions outside of the forms. Now, we're going to start to talk about some other ways of improving the performance where we're not really interacting with an end user. So it's not really direct, it doesn't have a direct impact on the user, but it does have an impact because if we improve how the server is working, if we improve how our processes are built, how our applications are built, taking into account the performance, obviously our servers are going to be more relaxed, we're not going to stress them as much, and this is going to allow the users to have better performance when they're trying to access graphical user interfaces. So here we have an example where we've designed, where we've configured a time event in a process, and we have two options. One of them is called dynamic and the other one's called unique. So we could select any of these two options. Sometimes I've seen that users just select dynamic by default because why not? It's the easiest way to go. You know, it's always going to evaluate things correctly because it's evaluating every single minute. So this is going to be, let's say it's going to be affecting or it's going to be stressing our server much more than when we select the second option. So if I say, no, I only want to check at one unique time, let's say I'm evaluating maybe a panel field, and this panel field is never going to change. I know someone input a value in the star message event of the process, and it's not going to change. Then why would I select dynamic if I know it's going to affect the server's performance? I would probably want to go for this other option called unique. So I'm only going to use this first option when it's strictly necessary. Here we can see the difference between selecting the first option and the second option is very big, because here we're just checking once in the life of the process, and here we're checking 1,440 times every single day. Imagine the stress level of the servers if we had hundreds or thousands of processes running every single day. So obviously this is really fast, it's not very important, but when it comes to hundreds or thousands of processes running every single day, then it might start to be important. It might start to add up to the stress levels of our servers. The same thing happens, for example, when we're building a diagram. I've seen loops and processes that are very badly built, and this could also affect the servers. Let's say here we have a part of a process where we have to check the ERP, but maybe it takes a few minutes for the ERP to respond. So basically what happens is checks the ERP, it goes down here. Did we receive the information from the ERP? No. Okay, we'll go back and check again. And maybe in 1 or 2 seconds, this has gone 200 or 300 times. So it's done hundreds of loops until at last it finds the result and the flow can go down this way. This would be a very poorly designed diagram. So what I recommend is we always create controls. So we have to create loop controls in order to control that this isn't happening. We can create loop controls with human intervention, or we can create loops with automatic controls or automatic intervention of the system. For example, each time there's loop, I could put a time event. I could ask the system, wait 1 minute. Maybe the ERP isn't ready yet, so wait a minute. And after that minute, try it again. And maybe only after it's tried 10 times, well, then maybe I'll allow human intervention. I'll say, look, the system has already tried 10 times during the last 10 minutes, and it's still not receiving any response. And then someone could actually interact and check and see if the ERP is up and running, or if they, I don't know, maybe the server's down or something happened. But anyways, this could also affect performance. Designing diagrams that are poorly designed, or they have designs that obviously aren't very optimized. Here I have another example. This isn't very common to take into account because the system is already prepared to be able to create conditional uploads. So basically what we're going to do, we're going to add a system task and add, I don't know, whatever amount of uploads we need to add. Here we have 10 different uploads, but besides each one of these uploads is conditioned. So what's the system going to do? It's going to evaluate the 8 uploads and the 8 conditions. It's a total of 16 operations. So let's say we have 1,000 daily processes. That would be about, let's round it to 6 million yearly operations that this object is performing. Now, here we've done exactly the same. We're going to configure the process to have the exact same output, but here we put a gateway that we're going to evaluate once, and then here we have 4 uploads, and here we have another 4 uploads. So here we're making one evaluation, and here we're making 4 evaluations. So basically we're triggering 5 operations. So multiplied by 1000 daily processes, let's round it to 2 million yearly operations. Okay, so the difference between 6 million and 2 million, that's quite a bit. So sometimes we're going to want to take into account these tricks. Obviously, this is going to be done by a consultant that has some experience, that is concerned about optimizing the diagrams. So when they're going to use intermediate time events, or when they're going to create a lot of conditional uploads, well, they're going to want to take these things into account in order to build their applications. Another important thing that the designers have to do is make sure the data in their applications is clean. I've seen certain projects where maybe it's a document management process, and someone uploads maybe several drafts of a document or different proposals of what the document should look like. Later on, it goes to an approver, then it goes to an editor. They create, let's say, the final draft. After that, it has to be approved again. Once it's been approved, the editor can start creating the end document, the one that's actually going to be published. And finally, once it's going to be published, obviously this document is in the panel of the process, but once it's going to be published, it automatically publishes it in a different library, and maybe it even creates a security copy. Now what happens? In the panel of the process, we maybe have about 10 or 15 different versions and different documents that could actually be scrapped. It doesn't make sense to keep all of those documents. Or maybe after some years, we should actually empty the data. So maybe the difference between having 1 terabyte of data in a poorly built process or having 10 terabytes, well, the difference is that we didn't really take into account that we had to clean the data once the process was finished, or after 5 years, or maybe we have a whole bunch of drafts or documents that are occupying space that we don't really need. So we have to make sure to try to keep things clean. Maybe people start processes and they never go anywhere. We don't really have to do anything with them. So maybe we should just delete that process. We could make the database of our application grow much slower if we're taking into account that we have to keep things clean. We don't want to build, creating all these drafts of documents or creating all these processes that aren't being used and that we don't really need for tracking or for monitoring. So what we're going to want to do is clean all of that and keep our system as clean as possible when we're building the applications. Okay, last but not least, I want to talk about 2 more features. First of all, I want to talk about the reports to monitor the performance. This is something I prefer to show you in the application. But anyways, we already saw that in certain scenarios, the performance of our forms could be much worse because we're updating the servers, we're doing maintenance, or we're making modifications in those forms. So we're going to want to review these reports. I've already explained them previously in the course, but we're going to take a look at them again just to know how we can monitor the performance here. So here, when we click on performance, when we go to structure and click here on performance, it's going to open this window. We've already talked about the different tabs and all of its features, but this is just a reminder. Here we can see the maximum amount of time that it took to open one of these forms. This isn't really reliable data. Here we have the average time. This is much more reliable. And here we have the minimum time, but the average time isn't that reliable either. Let's open one of these objects. For example, here we have one. It's taking about 3.7 seconds on average. That's quite a bit. Let me open it and let's see what happens with it. Okay, so I'm going to click on statistical distribution because it's a little bit easier to see the data displayed in this way. Okay, here we can see the result. Most of the time, it's taking about less than a second. Okay, 0.75. But then we have maybe these specific scenarios here. It took 60 seconds. Okay, this is a whole minute. Obviously, this is not something we're interested in, but we can see it's not a problem. These are very, very sporadic scenarios where this might have happened because we just modified the form. So we were applying changes. And once we saved those changes, the next time someone accesses the form, it might take a few seconds. Or maybe the server was being updated, they were doing maintenance, and for this reason, it's taking some more time. So when we take a sample, we're not going to want the average. We're going to want maybe we're going to want to discard about 80% of the data. So whatever's happening less, we're going to discard it. So it's going to grab, for example, these scenarios over here that aren't happening very much, and these over here. So we can focus on what's happening most of the time, or 80% of the time. So when we take a sample of 80%, this would be, let's say this would be much more reliable data to monitor the result. So here we can see it's taking between 0.25 seconds and about almost 2.5 seconds, okay? Now, let's say this is too slow. Our users are saying, well, this isn't good enough for me. It takes 2 seconds to open this form. Here we can see highlighted in red all the reasons of why it's taking 2 seconds. So, first of all, I have almost 9,000 divisions. I have almost 100,000 fields. I have a whole bunch of groups of fields. I have 60,000 conditions. This is a huge form. This is an enormous application. So it's normal that it's taking a few seconds to load. Besides, every time I open, I'm updating suffixes, I'm updating themes, I'm updating rules, and so on. So obviously, there's no possible way, or it's going to be very difficult, even though I invest on better servers or I try to design things correctly, if I have such a massive form. So in this case, I can see it's totally normal for it to be taking about 2 seconds to open. So thanks to this report, we're going to know if the issues are related to poor designs or bad designs, or maybe just to problems that are related to the server. Okay, but that's something we've talked about in another course. So we're going to go to this last feature I wanted to show you. And it's a best practice, but in this case, it's for organizing our work. So there's an option in the application that allows us to organize our applications. And this obviously, it's going to improve the performance of the designers. So what we can do is we can go to structure, we can go to applications, and we're going to start creating an application. All we have to do is give it a name, a description. We can indicate who's going to be the administrator of this application, what status it's in. We can also add a color and an image. Now we'll see what this is for. We can add a link, and then we can start adding components. So let's say I want to add interface components to my application, or logic components, users, or so on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add all of these here. So I have everything grouped under one name, under one application. That way, if I need to do maintenance or whatever, it's much easier to go to one unique place and find everything there than to have to go to structure and looking for the different groups that are involved in my application, or the different processes, or the different pages. So let's go to the platform and see an example of how this works. So when I enter structure, I'm going to click here on applications. Once I've clicked here, I can see I've got some applications already created. One of them is published, or I can create a new one from scratch. I'm just going to open one. When I click create, this window is going to pop up where I can add a name, a description, who's the administrator, as I was mentioning before, if it's in a certain status. And out here, this image or this color is for the card view. So here we have a card view where I can add an image. If it doesn't have an image, we'd actually be seeing the color. Here I can add a link. So the link to my application is this one here. When I click on this button, I can open the result. Let me add my user. So I just entered the application. Is a training portal with all these different features. And here we have different forms connected, different interfaces, different processes that are involved. So let's say this is the end user experience of my application, but it has different processes involved. It has families of records involved. It has groups of employees and so on. It even has pages. So all I have to do, if I want to add more components, I have to click here on add. I'd select the type of component. For example, I have a certain process I want to add. So this would be the process I want to add. All I have to do is click on it. I could add a description here, save and exit, and now I've got a new component added here to my application. Whenever I want to configure it, all I have to do is I have to click on it. I go here to edit, and I can start editing the process. So the user, let's say we have absolutely everything in this unique bucket where I'm storing all the different components that I'm going to be using in this application. Exercise 4.05, Part 3. Thank you for your attention.